You're listening to Natural Resources University. In this podcast network, our hosts are university researchers and extension specialists, opening your gateway to the science of natural resource management.
Welcome to Habitat University. This podcast is your source for the science behind wildlife habitat management and is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network. We're your host, Jared Brook.
And I'm Adam Janke, and we're both biologists and extension wildlife specialists. If you're interested in wildlife habitat management or looking for ways to improve your property for wildlife, this is the podcast for you.
So join us as we talk with researchers, managers, and landowners all about the latest research and the ins and outs of wildlife habitat management.
Welcome back to the show. This time we're talking about a topic that we got started on last week, and we've been alluding to this topic all along, and it's pretty central to the things that habitat managers are always dealing with. But we decided to square up and go right into the issue of invasive species and how it is that wildlife habitat managers have to deal with invasive species in their day-to-day and how it impacts wildlife and wildlife habitat that we're trying to manage.
Adam, I've had this episode on my mind for several months now, and the reason it was on my mind is because back in the spring, I was emailed a old wildlife management plan from one of our Purdue properties, and I was really interested to look back at some of the old recommendations and things. And this plan was written by a predecessor of mine here at Purdue, and then one of our state wildlife agency biologists who's since retired. And this plan was written in the 70s, and it was really interesting to look at. And the reason that this episode's on the top of my mind is because within that plan, there are lots of recommendations on how to improve habitat for wildlife around the farm. Most all of those recommendations had to deal with planting something. And most of the species that they were looking at planting are species that we now know are invasive species. Now, obviously, hindsight being 2020, we definitely wouldn't make those same recommendations today. At least I wouldn't. But back then, there was a different thought and idea and mentality, and we didn't know as much information about some of these species. So it's not like the recommendations that were in there were out of place for that time period. It just seemed out of place looking at it, 40 or almost 50 years later, right? So it just seems...
benefit of hindsight.
That's right, benefit of hindsight. But the main ones that they were planting were going to be autumn olive, Sericea Lespedeza, and Bicolor Lespedeza. Yeah. And I still work on that same property today, and we did an edge feathering project around one of the crop fields around there, and guess what we're fighting now?
Those three species.
Not all three, but we're fighting autumn olive and multiflora rose as well, which was probably planted long before the 70s by other conservation-minded folks who were interested in things like controlling erosion, creating living fences for cattle, and even wildlife habitat. So
that's such an interesting case study, and it definitely plays out across the history of the evolution of modern wildlife management in the United States, that we thought, well, if a native species of shrub that's already here produces a couple of berries, but this species of shrub from wherever far away land produces bushels of berries every year, then this other one must certainly be better than our native one. And we kind of got carried away. And today we fortunately have the hindsight to understand that. And what we're going to talk about in this episode today is what we know now that folks back then didn't know, or at least the people that saw this coming didn't have their voices heard well enough to forego it. So another thing in preparing for this, and you've already introduced Lespedeza, and I bet that's a plant that will send chills down the spines of many of our listeners for the reasons you just listed. And when we were at last week's episode, remember we quoted that book, Martin, American Wildlife and Plants, A Guide to Wildlife Food Habits. When we were preparing for that show, we saw this quote that was perfect for this week's episode on invasive species. talking about dual purpose plants and this sort of ethos or this thinking that prevailed. This book was published in like 1955. Martin wrote, bobwhite quail have found a recently introduced perennial shrub, Lespedeza or Lespedeza bicolor, an excellent dual-purpose plant. The heavy crop of seeds of this legume is relished by the bobwhites, and the dense growth provides some cover in winter as well as during the growing season. So right there in a really formative book in our profession, championing a plant that we today know wasn't really all it was cracked up to be, and it's just created way more problems for the bobwhite than it has good.
Yeah, and you'll still find a lot of literature talking about bicolor specifically as a quail food plant, as a quail cover plant, and it certainly provides a food that they eat, and it certainly provides cover. But generally, the benefits are outweighed by the detriments that it causes. And we have some properties here in Indiana that I've seen it on and seen it growing, but it doesn't typically tend to be very invasive here in Indiana. But the farther south you go, the more it tends to be a problem from an invasive standpoint, where it starts to shade out native species and mess with forest regeneration and that kind of stuff. So definitely can be a problem. And in my previous life as a private lands biologist in a state to the south of here, I actually ran across a recommendation for planting bicolor as far as close back as about 2005, 2006 was a recommendation. And I got the call from the landowner that said, hey, I got this bicolor stuff that's taken over my field. What do I need to do about it? But it was recommended to him to plant it back in the mid 2000s.
Wow. Yeah. So it's not our distant past necessarily that we're talking about. We still see these issues. And I think in a little bit, we're going to talk about the horticulture industry, and we definitely still have challenges with all sorts of stuff being shipped all over the place that, is marketed occasionally as good for wildlife, and it really isn't in the aggregate. Maybe in a vacuum, it could be good for wildlife, but once it enters into these ecosystems, we can have these real problems. So, okay. So the task at hand today is to talk about invasive species. And we're going to take a very different approach for the podcast. This is our 11th episode, 12th if you count the time that we introduced ourselves in episode 0. But we're calling it our 11th episode in season 1, which we've looked at all along as kind of our season to do the basics, to lay the groundwork. This is our second to last episode. And our last one, we're just going to talk about what we learned in the season and how we talk about wildlife habitat education. And so, we're going to do something different on our 11th episode here. We're going to talk first, get some definitions, get on the same page and what we're talking about when we talk about what an invasive species is and why wildlife habitat managers are so always battling invasive species. And then we're going to shift gears and do a couple of case studies. We're going to jump over to your home state, to Indiana, to talk about an expert that's working with the Nature Conservancy there to do some really neat and innovative invasive species hand-to-hand combat, we could say. And then we're going to jump down to the south, and we're going to learn about a different type of invasive species, a vertebrate invasive species. And we're going to talk to our friend Bronson Strickland about his work with feral hogs and other invasive species in the south. And so, but before we do that, we're going to get into some definitions, and we're going to dig in on what exactly we mean when we say invasive species, the stuff we wish those people in the 50s and 70s and everything else would have known that we know today, to try to avoid some of these challenges. So kick it off, Jared. What do we mean when we say invasive species?
All right. So it's a big gray area when we talk about what is an invasive species. There are some hard and fast definitions. There's also some kind of wiggle room around those definitions. And so we'll just start off with what the USDA, so U.S. Department of Agriculture, defines as an invasive species. And it defines it, and it has to meet these two criteria. The first is that it has to be non-native to an ecosystem under consideration, so non-native to the area ecosystem, and whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. So by that definition, it has to be not native, which we'll get into the gray area there, but it also has to cause some sort of harm either to the environment, to economic harm, or human health.
Yeah. Okay. I can like barely control myself. I'm looking at you and Zoom like for your signal. Like, can I go right now? What's up with that? Why do they say it has to be non-native? I guess that's not consistent with my understanding of what an invasive species is, and it's definitely not how I use the term day to day. Now, in general, I will say my most problematic invasive species list is almost all species that would be considered non-native, but I'm surprised that's in the USDA definition when we have native species like eastern red cedar that, you know, in small quantities are really good parts of rangeland ecosystems, say, but in large quantities can just really take over and present some real challenges for those ecosystems that have been modified. And it's a native species, but it's definitely an invasive species.
But I think that non-native is in there from that definition to kind of underscore that the fact that most of the time these invasive species are inhabiting an ecosystem under which they did not develop. So they bring some sort of, and we'll get into this later, they bring some sort of competitive advantage, or they lack predators or something that they did not develop with the same kind of ecosystem constraints as those other native species inside that ecosystem.
Yeah. I get why they say that. And like I said, in practice, for the most part, a invasive species tends to be an exotic species too. But these ecosystems are so modified, and there's characteristics of native species that were held in check through like disturbance, fire, grazing, flooding.
Yeah, so
things like that.
in that case of eastern red cedar, right? So it's becoming invasive or problematic because of the loss of some of those disturbances.
Yeah,
those
exactly.
Historic disturbances like fire and grazing.
Yeah. So it's an invasive species. It becomes invasive. We also like another one that I hear people talking about is actually poison ivy. And I've definitely found places where there's like really disturbed areas where poison ivy just kind of takes over. And I think we could kind of objectively look at that and say like, oh yeah, that's an invasive species. That species has invaded. Now, I'm okay with like directing more angst towards the exotic ones. Like I would see like a monoculture of poison ivy and be like, oh, okay, well, it has some redeeming qualities. Like birds eat poison ivy berries and stuff. Like I don't want to go near it. Yeah. So there are some like redeeming qualities of certain invasives that I don't reserve for exotic species. Like I really just have no space for exotic species for the most part. And so I do get that distinction, but I still think for the podcast, let's adopt a broader definition, one that dispenses with this native and native and exotic business and focuses on the impacts of an organism on the ecosystem.
So you're a wetland person, Adam. What about cattails? That's one of the I commonly hear as invasive, and there is some hybridizing.
That's the thing.
Non-native and native
right.
cattails, but even from the native cattails can be problematic where they take over wetlands.
Yeah, and we're going to get into this when we talk about like what are the characteristics of these invasive species. And cattails is one of them. Like just like eastern red cedar invades western like Great Plains rangelands in the absence of fire. Cattail can invade riverine wetland ecosystems because of high nutrient inputs that are totally artificial, right? And so that's the thing. The cattail thing is super complicated though too because a hybrid cattail. So complicated that I feel like we'd need a botanist on the show to really like do it justice. I just kind of like stick my head in the sand when it comes to cattail, native, not, just because of that whole hybridization thing.
So we have, Adam, I did find one more definition if we want to go with that one.
Okay. Does it not have non-native and native in it?
So here it is. I'll just give it to you, and we'll link to the PDF that this comes from. But an invasive species is a species of plant or animal that outcompetes other species, causing damage to an ecosystem. This can be native or non-native.
Oh, I like that. Where was that from?
So that definition is actually from here in Indiana, from Grace College, the Lilly Center for lakes and streams. And so we'll put it's from a blog that they wrote, and we'll put that up on the show notes.
Okay, I'm liking it. One thing that I heard in your definition, which again I like more because it has the whole like native, not native thing omitted, is animal, plant or animal. And I don't think we had really been talking about that. I will say that I almost exclusively think of invasive species as plants. But it is true that there's lots of different types of invasive species that fall into all sorts of different taxa. And if we went through them like sort of hierarchically, pathogens like exotic fungi are a huge problem. And that's like the fungus that causes white nose syndrome in bats. That's an invasive species. Like it has all these same characteristics that we're going to talk about. We talk mostly about plants. And so fungi can be invasive species. Insects like emerald ash borer is certainly an invasive species and real problematic in ecosystems. There's vertebrates like nutria or feral swine and others that can be really problematic invasive species. And then finally plants, like, of course, that's what we primarily think about. And that's the examples that I think we're always going to be kind of tempted to go to in our discussion.
Yeah, those are all really good examples and I tend to think about plants too when I think about invasives, just because I'm typically thinking about habitat for whatever wildlife species. And we learned last week the root of all wildlife habitat is plants.
That's right.
So I'm thinking about how can I manage those invasive species.
Yeah.
Before we go on, I think we got some hashing out we need to do with this definition, because I think you and I may be in a little bit disagreement on what we think is the better definition of invasives.
So are you voting then for the USDA one?
I'm voting more for the USDA one. And
no.
I would have to, if we, and maybe we'll do this, if we polled ecologists from across the country, I would say that a majority of those ecologists would lean towards the USDA definition of it not being, that has to be non-native to that ecosystem as a qualifier for an invasive species. Otherwise, it's just what I call an aggressive native. We have lots of aggressive natives, like Canada goldenrod here in Indiana is native to the ecosystems, but it gets pretty aggressive, and you have to do something to control it. So
it is a little bit semantics. It's like tomato, but
a little bit semantics, but it's helpful to have those clear sideboards, right? Of like here.
Well, but you can say exotic invasive species. Like I say that all the time.
But in my definition of invasive species,
you just ditch the appendage.
Yeah, ditch the appendage, and it's generally always non-native. Now this is an interesting point, because I think it brings up the kind of gray area that this definition and things live in, right? Where not even all ecologists agree on what the right definition is.
Right. Yeah, and I agree.
So
with
maybe we'll pitch that in the Twitter poll or something.
I think we should definitely pitch that somehow, and we should get some feedback from listeners on the survey or whatever. But I bet you almost anything there would be strong regional differences, because the challenge in many rangeland ecosystems, like I'm thinking Nebraska, Oklahoma, Kansas, southern Iowa, northern Missouri, like one of the biggest challenges is this eastern red cedar issue that I've been talking about. And eastern red cedar is a great native plant in small quantities, but in large quantities and in the absence of disturbances that would have historically checked it, it just becomes really invasive, or to use your word, aggressive. But I don't know. I feel like the more precise definition would be to say exotic invasive species when we're talking about exotic species that display invasive tendencies, and then to say invasive species as more of a generic or more of a broad inclusive definition. So I'm going to hold by my definition. You can have yours, and we'll let the listeners maybe decide. I think our next discussion is going to help inform this too, because we want to talk about what makes an invasive species invasive.
Yeah. So we'll leave it to the Twitter poll to decide.
Okay, fine. Though I don't think any Twitter poll would sway my opinion. So go ahead and try, listeners. If you don't agree with me, I'm going to stand by my definition.
They know who
that
to
excludes
vote for.
this.
They know whose definition is right.
Okay. So here, though, one way that I think I'm going to prove you wrong is by going through the definition of an invasive species, and then we'll come back to like, wait, so what about this aggressive versus invasive? So let's try this and we'll see where it goes.
Prove me wrong.
Okay. So, okay. We wanted to talk about what is an invasive species. We mentioned all these things, and I wanted to mention another thing is like ecosystems. Like we almost always talk about terrestrial ecosystems, but there's an acronym out there, AIS, aquatic invasive species, and it is like an entire world, an entire industry. They have billboards and everything all about aquatic invasive species. So we'll try to think of some aquatic examples too as we go, and it's a really neat, well-developed field of like education, scholarly inquiry, and active management. So aquatic invasive species. So the principles apply across terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems about what makes an invasive species invasive. And there's this paper that I really like from the range science literature primarily. They mostly talk about this in range science context, that talks about the invasion triangle. And it's funny, we have these triangles like common in ecology, don't we? Like the fire triangle, and there's others. And but the invasion triangle are like these three axes that create conditions that make a certain species invasive in a given ecosystem. And the three attributes are, I'll just list them, and then I kind of want to discuss each one of these individually because it will help us with this definition, understanding what invasive species are. So the three axes of the triangle are invader attributes, characteristics of the species itself, site biotic characteristics, which is like the characteristics of all the other organisms that occupy the site that's being invaded, and site environmental conditions, which is like the abiotic characteristics of a site. So, well, one, that sounds a lot like a definition of habitat that we've been using, doesn't it? And two, it'll be fun, I think, to walk through each one of these. So the first one, invader attributes. And so I think this is probably more what we think about when we talk about an invasive species. Like, I used at the top of the show, like this example of like, well, bushels of berries must be better than just a couple of berries that native shrubs produce. And we find that pretty commonly across invasive species, that they're really fecund. It's not universally true, but they tend to be pretty productive. That's one common characteristic of invasive species.
So they produce a lot of seed, right? Or they're very good at reproducing if we're talking about animals and
Yeah.
other types of invasive species. And a lot of times we picked species based on that particular trait.
Yeah. I mean, that's how it is that a lot of these things come to be introduced. Like, isn't that true of that example that you shared with all those like autumn olive and Lespedeza and all that stuff? They were planting that stuff because it was like, look at all this food that these things produce. And food is one of the elements of habitat. So we must introduce these things to find that they have all this food. Now, we talked about last week, or I shouldn't say last week, but last episode with Dr. Harper, not all the time are animals able to actually use those foods. That's one thing we've learned about invasive species, but that's aside. You can go back to that episode and think more about that. So that's one characteristic of like the invader attributes, just a characteristic of the species. They tend to be really productive, and they also tend to have pretty short life cycles. Like they reproduce pretty quickly and can be pretty aggressive.
One of the other interesting things too about invasive plants, if we think about plants, is that from the aspect of bush honeysuckle, they also have different, their ecology is a little different. So they have invasive species are able to be more competitive for a lot of reasons. But one of the reasons specifically with bush honeysuckle is that it has a longer photo period. So it's capturing sunlight in areas that are pretty shaded before the leaves set on the native species and after the leaves fall off. So it can kind of fill those niches in those environments and become more problematic.
Yeah, so like the photoperiod thing's real interesting. I always say like if you should go to your woods, at least in Iowa, the upper Midwest, go to your woods and around Thanksgiving time. If it's still green, then that means you have an invasive species problem because those invasive species are still photosynthesizing at Thanksgiving when all of our other deciduous shrubs have dropped all their leaves. So yeah, that's definitely a good one. Another one is like the paper actually talks about it as novel weapons. Like the species, sometimes these invasive species bring tools with them, so to speak. I mean, that's a little bit anthropocentric, but they bring with them the ability to change their environment. And so they might, like honeysuckle is known to display alleliopathy, which means that it's actually emitting a chemical that suppresses the growth of other plants around it. All the listeners will probably be familiar with walnuts. You know, you can't grow tomatoes under walnuts because of alleliopathy. Well, that's the same thing with honeysuckle. Is honeysuckle, these exotic species of honeysuckle that become invasive, are bringing with them chemicals that change their environments, these novel weapons, so to speak, as another way to make a species pretty invasive.
Yeah, and I think another one too that kind of goes along the same lines is, and I think in the paper they call it engineering, but they have certain traits about them that allows them to make their environment more favorable for themselves. So one really good one is nitrogen fixation, and this also allows them to grow on very poor disturbed sites. And a good example of this is Sericea Lespedeza, which we'll talk about more later, but it's a nitrogen fixer. It grows on very disturbed sites with very low soil nitrogen and low soil quality overall. But because it can make its own nitrogen, it can thrive in these areas and outcompete other plants.
Yeah, that's a good example. Another way that this engineering thing factors in is invasive species can alter the nutrient cycling or fire regimes in the places that they invade. So as they become more and more abundant. So we talked a little bit about hybrid cattail at the top, and that's one. Hybrid cattail benefits actually from like the accumulation of litter, and it becomes like almost a positive feedback loop where like hybrid cattail begets more hybrid cattail, and then it gets to a scenario where just other plants can't compete. And this is an example I don't know quite as much about, but out west, cheatgrass is huge. And I remember learning that cheatgrass, one way that it really changes those ecosystems is that it creates a carpet of fuels in landscapes where historically fire would have been more patchy. And cheatgrass connects essentially all these disparate fuels, and it fuels wildfires in a way that native plants, more patchily distributed in those arid western rangelands, wouldn't have necessarily fueled them. And it can create this, it can engineer these ecosystems that are more favorable to the plant itself. So another engineering example and an invader attribute.
Yeah, so those are all really good ones. So what about, we've kind of hit on a lot of those invader attributes. Now, what about site biological or biotic characteristics?
Yeah. Another thing I think about as invader attributes that the paper actually talks about is site biotic characteristics. So this is a good transition. I always think like, well, a lot of these invasive species are just not impacted by pests, you know, and so I think of that almost as an invader attribute, but really it's a site attribute because of course those species, especially when they're exotic, have pests that impact them. But there are conditions at the site that ultimately becomes invaded by these invasive species that, you know, suppress those enemies, or in the case of exotic invasive species, they aren't even there at all. And so, you know, the horticulture industry that we'll talk a little bit more about, and I've already mentioned, you know, they breed plants for this. Like you don't want holes in your leaves, you don't want fungal growth on your trees or whatever. Like they select for plants that don't have a lot of enemies, and then they introduce them so that they'll always be pretty, aesthetically pleasing or whatever. Well, that's the recipe for creating an invasive species because nothing is controlling it. There are no insects feeding on the foliage, or there are no predators in the case perhaps of an invasive vertebrate or invertebrate or plant. And so that's, the paper talks about that as the site biotic characteristics. What is the community of other organisms at the site that may be able to fight off an invasion? And what we find is that places that become invaded often don't have those natural enemies.
Yeah, so another one that has to do with site biotic characteristics is the diversity of the plant community or diversity of the ecosystem in the area. So there's a lot of research into especially prairie ecosystems and invasions by things like Canada thistle and spotted knapweed and other invasive plants. And a lot of the research is into how likely is a prairie going to be in, how likely is it that a prairie is going to be invaded by an invasive species given the diversity of plant species are there. And a lot of research shows that more diversity of a plant species, the more diverse a prairie and an ecosystem is, the more resistant it is to a biological invasion by other plant species, because all of the different niches and resources are being utilized and there's not any resources available for those invasive species.
Yeah, and that's actually a perfect transition to the last axis of the invasion triangle, and that's site environmental conditions. And the whole diversity argument, the paper talks about that a bunch. It's really interesting. They do say it's kind of debated. Like, there are definitely really good examples where more diverse plant communities, say, are more robust to threats of invasion, but that isn't perfect. But one of the hypotheses about why a diverse plant community would be more robust to an invasion is because there wouldn't be a lot of extra resources available. And that's kind of where the line blurs into the third axis of the triangle and site environmental conditions. Because what's there at the site available for an organism to take advantage of? What are the nutrients in the soil, or what's the moisture condition, or the sunlight hitting the site? Like, are those characteristics favorable for the growth of this invasive plant, or is that a niche that's already occupied by another organism found there?
Along those same lines, you often hear about invasive species being doing better in disturbed sites, right? So on these sites where you have likely more sunlight reaching bare soil to stimulate germination, you have less diversity or less plants overall that are there to kind of occupy that space and take those resources. And so these invasive species are able to kind of utilize what's there. And then they also have those other competitive advantages of being able to oftentimes live in poor soils and use those resources. So that disturbed site hits on that site environmental conditions.
Yeah, that's right. And that's kind of also connects back up to that invader attributes. All these things kind of blur together, but it does provide like a nice structure to think about them. The last sort of site environmental conditions consideration that I think we should talk about is like the fact that oceans historically prevented a lot of invasions by exotic species. And what we find is like the species that become problematic in, say, in any given landscape often come from comparable landscapes, like comparable soil conditions, comparable climate conditions, comparable ecosystems, but separated by an ocean. And globalization has created this scenario where those ocean barriers that historically were impermeable to different species are, traversed overnight in an overnight flight. And so there's this really interesting paper that we'll put in the show notes from Iowa, a geographic assessment of risks of naturalization of non-native woody plants in Iowa. And they looked at they looked at a bunch of species that had naturalized in Iowa, which is to say they've basically become invasive, exotic species that have become invasive, and a bunch of species that were introduced in Iowa, but didn't become problematic invasives. And the 28 species that became problematic invasive species, the vast majority of them just came from like the exact same ecosystems, the exact same latitudes, and the exact same site histories in Russia and Asia that we find here in Iowa. Like, just pick out wherever Iowa would occur on the map in terms of latitude and climates and geologic history in Russia and Asia, and you can pick out which species are going to, when they show up here, become problematic invasive species. So listeners to the show are going to be familiar with habitat requirements of many different organisms. And we find in a globalized world, when we're moving organisms all over the place, sometimes those habitat requirements are met and species thrive or become invasive. Add into the mix a bunch of external influences like climate change, land use change, and mutualistic interactions between invasive species, one invasive species creating conditions suitable for another. And we have a lot of challenges in our really modified landscapes as it relates to invasive species. And we can kind of track them back through and predict when they may become problematic based on these characteristics that we just talked about, this invasion triangle.
Yeah, so when you talked about that, that kind of brings up the next question of, well, how did they all get here? And we won't spend a lot of time on this, but I think it's important to think about how we got some of our invasive species so that moving forward, we can kind of think about maybe not doing what we've done in the past. And this is like a really good opportunity for us as wildlife biologists to really look in the mirror and say, oh man, maybe we shouldn't do that anymore. So I found this publication that talks about kind of the origins of invasive species a little bit. And it's from the Invasive Plant Atlas of New England. And that the numbers that we're going to talk about depend on kind of the different sources you use, but they're generally aligned in this kind of order. So in this publication, it says that 60% of our invasive plant species come from the horticulture field. And I've heard as high as 70 or 80%, but generally the vast majority of invasive species come from horticulture. So plants we've bred to put in landscaping, escape the landscaping, are now out in the environment.
So examples of this, like that come to my mind, I don't know what your examples are, but like Japanese barberry, burning bush, Bradford pear, like those are my top three. How about you?
Yeah, those are three good ones. Japanese knotweed is another one that you'll find up kind of in the Northeast a lot. We have it a little bit here in Indiana, but yeah, a lot of those come from the horticulture industry. And unfortunately, a lot of those plants that you mentioned are still being sold for landscaping in a variety of different states. But again, looking in the mirror at mistakes that conservationists have made in the past, this publication puts at about 30% of the invasive plant species are a result of introductions for conservation purposes, whether that's for soil erosion, creating habitat for wildlife, forage, all kinds of different things, creating living fences like multiflora rows. So not the main way of introduction, but certainly a big way that we've got a lot of invasive species. And then this publication says it's about 10% are accidental introductions. And you could probably say one that I think about from accidental introductions is Japanese stilt grass or Japan grass, lots of different common names for it, but it actually came over in as packaging and shipping containers. So it was used as packaging and then got in the environment. Zebra mussels is another one, came over in ballast water of ships. So accidental introductions, but that accounts for only about 10%. So it's not the main way they come over, but certainly one potential way.
So how do they impact wildlife habitat? I mean, that's the real question, right? We've sort of been listing these species, and we've been talking about what creates characteristics that makes them likely to be invasive. What is the consequence of invasive species on wildlife and wildlife habitat?
That's a good question, Adam. I'm glad you asked. I just happened to find a resource that kind of hits right at that point. So this comes from a book called Wildlife Habitat Conservation, and there's an entire chapter on the impact of invasive species on wildlife habitat. So there's three kind of main ways that this chapter outlines that invasive plants impact wildlife and wildlife habitat. And those are by altering the vegetation composition so that the structure and or cover is changed, lost, or degraded. They replace and reduce or make inaccessible plants or invertebrates that provide food. And then they change the physical properties or physical processes like the soil chemistry, water flow, disturbance regimes within an ecosystem.
Interesting. Yeah. that's the one for plants. And I see lots of themes from the plants episode last week that we don't necessarily need to rehash, but I really like this: replace or otherwise make inaccessible plants or inverts. Lots of times we see an invasive plant out there and think like, oh, that's probably providing sufficient food or structure. And we find that organisms just aren't adapted. It's not palatable to the wildlife species that we're trying to manage for. So those three, that's a really inclusive accounting, I think, of the impact that invasive plants have. So good resource.
Yeah. And so I think there's some really prime examples that we could go through of each one of those by itself, but you can probably say that most invasive species kind of hit on all three of those, right?
Yeah.
One that that hits all three is bush honeysuckle. So we have that here in Indiana, most of the Midwest. It alters the composition of the vegetation, changes the cover. It actually almost adds another entire layer into the forest structure, and that can benefit from a nesting standpoint a lot of shrub nesting birds. But going back to that cover is degraded point, there's lots of research to suggest that nests are more predated, or it's less beneficial for those species to be nesting in bush honeysuckle as opposed to native plant species like dogwoods and others. Along the same vein with bush honeysuckle outcompetes native plants, so it replaces a lot of the native plant species that provide food for different wildlife species, but it also replaces plants that are important from invertebrates as well that can provide important food resources for wildlife. And then it's allelopathic, so it changes kind of the chemical properties of the soil and allows it to kind of just continue to invade the areas and create a monoculture of bush honeysuckle. So one that hits all three there.
Yeah, that's a really great example with the honeysuckle. And, I think you talked about that nested sort of underneath plants, but that's true of other taxa that can become invasive. Like think about the drastic impacts that zebra mussels, for example, have had in aquatic ecosystems, just totally changing the environment because of the way that they feed in those ecosystems. And so I think when we talk about other organisms other than plants, we could check many of those things: altering the structure of vegetation, the way that vertebrates or invertebrates feed. Imagine the impact of emerald ash borer. That's had a huge impact on vegetation, or replacing types of vegetation that's going to have rippling impacts throughout the ecosystem. The only other thing that I feel like we should add for animals in terms of the direct impact, of invertebrates and vertebrates, which I guess would be animals, is that sometimes invasive species can actually physically kill native wildlife or directly manipulate them. That's a little different than the habitat thing that we tend to talk about. We tend to think about food, water, and cover.
Are we going to get into a feral cat discussion?
Oh, don't tempt me. Episode 11, there it was, folks. We brought up feral cats for the first time. Let's not. But that's tempting.
It is an invasive species, right?
It's totally an invasive species. And you can send all that hate mail to Jared Brook at Purdue University. Okay, so I don't think our listeners are going to object to that label on an outdoor cat. But yeah, that's a great example of invasive species that's problematic. And frankly, it's, it would impact the way we manage wildlife habitat. If we know we have a novel predator in the landscape, that we may need to think about a different way that we manage habitat for a species. And then other invasive species, we're going to talk to Bronson about feral hogs and what impacts they may have on forest environments and things. And that's going to be an interesting discussion. And then, this fungus that causes white nose syndrome is a really good example of a really problematic invasive species. It was accidentally introduced, and it's just completely changed the landscape for bats in the eastern United States. And that's through a direct effect, which is what we're talking about here. And that is a direct effect on the physiology of those bats. So it's just another example of an impact of invasives, though a little bit beyond wildlife habitat that we're focused on. So, okay. So we just talked, that was a neat resource and neat discussion on the direct impacts of invasive species on wildlife and wildlife habitat. What about the indirect impacts of some of those species, invasive species, on wildlife and wildlife habitat?
One example that the book gave was one that had to do with changing the microclimate of the environment and making it less favorable for, say, a native wildlife species. And the example they gave had to do with hemlock woolly adelgient in the Appalachians, and it consuming hemlock trees and killing hemlock trees. And what that caused was the hemlock trees that are around the streams and things in the Appalachians there, they started to die, which then allowed more sunlight, and it warmed the streams in which brook trout live. And that changed the microclimate and made them less favorable for brook trout.
That example reminds me of a scenario that I'm pretty familiar with, which is the impacts of exotic fish on wetland ecosystems. And that's like carp and other benthivorous fish will come into these wetlands. They're oftentimes exotic. They're not always necessarily exotic species, but then they, just by the nature of the way that they feed at the sediment, can disrupt the sediment, pump nutrients up out of the ground and into the water column. It increases turbidity, which suppresses the growth of aquatic plants. And then all of a sudden, you no longer have plants that provide the structure and the food and cover that the animals that use those wetland ecosystems have come to rely on. And so that's an indirect impact of that invasion, because they just totally disrupt the trophic structure of an aquatic organism or an aquatic ecosystem.
So we talked a lot about kind of the impacts of invasives on wildlife and wildlife habitat, and just to kind of bring it around to where we began and maybe give a little bit of an example of how this all works in the real world. I kind of wanted to tie it back to how we kind of began the episode, Adam, when we talked about some of the mistakes that wildlife managers made with planting some of these invasive species, and now how we're trying to fix some of those problems. And the example that I have has to deal with the species that we kind of listed up top, or one of them, which was Ceresia lespedeza. And I bring that example up because for my master's degree, I did a lot of research at the University of Tennessee, did a lot of research on the impacts of mine reclamation on northern bobwhite in Kentucky. And if you're familiar with reclaimed mine lands at all, in Kentucky, they're mainly all Ceresia lespedeza. So it was planted there as a way to stop erosion and allow some sort of vegetation to be on the site. And so these sites have turned into almost exclusively Ceresia lespedeza. So lots and lots of invasive species issues there. These sites were pretty large sites, and we were looking to improve them for bobwhite, whatever management tools we could use. And so what some of the research revealed was that there was lots of benefits to us using tools that were going to reduce Ceresia lespedeza. And some of those things that we used were things like herbicide to kill Ceresia. We also used disking, so disturbing the soil. And in a lot of cases, disturbing the soil will actually make Ceresia worse. But on our sites, they're so different from what you would have in most undisturbed areas that disking was about the only tool that we had to thin or reduce their Ceresia other than herbicide. So some of the things that we found were that bobwhite would select to nest in areas where we had controlled Ceresia lespedeza. So we had less Ceresia, and other plants were more common, and it made it better for bobwhite nesting. We also found that hens and male bobwhite would take their broods to areas that we had treated for Ceresia lespedeza. So we had changed that plant community from Ceresia more to an annual plant community, and that made it better for bobwhite broods. And then back to nesting, on areas that we treated, we actually had about 40% more nests than we did in untreated areas. So we were able to increase nesting in areas we treated to control Ceresia lespedeza. And then we actually had higher summer survival of bobwhites on areas that we had treated to control Ceresia lespedeza. So lots of benefits in our study to having controlled Ceresia lespedeza.
Yeah, that's a really nice study to kind of show the scope of the potential impacts of widespread Ceresia in this case on bobwhites, and then also the potential for wildlife habitat managers to do good by the actions that they take to address invasive species. So I think that's where we want to go now, is like we've said, like invasive species are this ubiquitous challenge. We just listed all of these issues that invasive species create directly for wildlife or indirectly for wildlife by their manipulations of the ecosystems, their impacts on other plants, and so on and so forth. So now what we want to do is kind of get into the weeds a little bit, I think, and get some expertise. And importantly, I think for invasive species, perhaps more than any other topic that we've covered on the podcast so far, is we need some geographical diversity here too, because what's an invasive in Iowa is not necessarily an invasive in Indiana. And that's definitely true as you go out further west or you go further south. And so that's what we're going to do for the rest of the show, is bring in some different perspectives and have some discussions about different types of invasive species and how it is that we manage them, or what impacts they have on ecosystems across the U.S.
Yeah, so our first guest that we're going to have on is actually Dawn Slack from the Indiana chapter of the Nature Conservancy, and she's the stewardship director for the Indiana TNC, and she helps lead basically an invasive species program for landowners to help them with control and monitoring and identifying invasive species on their property. So we talked a lot about the impact these invasive species have. Now we're going to jump into, here's some things you can do or steps you can take on your property to actually go about controlling those invasive species.
Awesome. Well, I'm really looking forward to hearing that discussion, and we'll cut to you and Dawn here now.
So I'm here with Dawn Slack from the Nature Conservancy, and we're here to talk all about the impacts of invasive species on ecosystems and on wildlife habitat. So Dawn, what is your role with TNC? What is your day-to-day job look like?
I am the director of stewardship. So I'm also the project coordinator for another statewide program called the Indiana Invasives Initiative. And both of those keep me busy. I travel all over the state. I work with a lot of people, and I do a lot of land management.
All right. So invasives is right up your alley then, right? So it
is
something you deal with all the time?
Every day.
Fortunately and unfortunately?
That is correct. Yes.
Yeah.
Fortunately, because it leads us to a wonderful habitat restoration program.
Great. And so tell me a little bit more about the Indiana Invasives Initiative.
So that initiative is a statewide program that allows us to really do grassroots work right there with those private landowners. And we are engaged with those landowners to try to share our resources and our knowledge, also learn from them. And collectively, we want to basically just bolster conservation across the state. We want to make habitat available for as much wildlife as we possibly can. Insects, to deer, to large mammals, small mammals, whatever. We want to give them room to live. Yes.
Okay, and so that's an Indiana initiative. Is there similar type initiatives in other states?
Other states do also have programs that work with landowners, probably not in the same way that we are. I think we're the first one to really roll it out in a county by county level. So most of them do it regionally. Great. We're really digging in deep.
Well, it sounds like there's a lot of really good stuff going on in Indiana, Dawn. And so when we talk about invasive species, can you tell me a little bit about some of the harm that invasive species cause in ecosystems?
So invasive species will simply, for the most part, just take over. They crowd out our native species. They remove our native habitat. They remove food. They can, some of them even pollute or cause toxins. Let me give you an example. One that's pretty ubiquitous across Indiana is, let's just say, Japanese honeysuckle or bush honeysuckle, or even autumn olive. They've been around for a long time. In fact, we planted most of them many years ago, and they have spread. They have taken over the understory of a forest, and they've suppressed tree growth. They've moved out and taken over the habitat for our native plants that would support being food for deer, food for insects, food for other wildlife. And they create these thick areas of monocultures. And that means there's a loss of natural plants, native plants. There's a loss of insects. There's a loss of wildlife associated with that. So that's kind of the main thing, is they create thick infestations of one species or maybe two, and then they crowd out our native species.
So you talked a little bit about some of the harm that invasive species can cause and related that to wildlife in the form of, reducing food and cover and other resources for wildlife. And we talked really in depth about that in the kind of the prelude to this interview in the earlier part of the episode. So with this, I really wanted to take some time to think about, okay, so once, say we're a landowner, once we've kind of recognized that invasive species are an issue, and it may be an issue for whatever wildlife species we're interested in our property, what do we do about it? How do we go about actually rectifying the situation and trying to control or get rid of invasive species?
Well, one of the first things I would ask you to do is start learning about invasive species. You need to learn to identify them. And we have a grassroots program that we are working with all different kinds of agencies. So I would ask all landowners to seek their local help. That's from their Purdue Extension. That's from the Indiana Invasives Initiative. You can check out the Purdue Extension website. You can check out SICM's website, and that's SICIM.info. If you go onto those two websites, you're going to find a plethora of information about what's going on in your county. You can sign up for a free landowner survey. We come, we walk, we talk and chat with you. We create a plan for you at no charge. We hook you up with those local resources. We teach you to identify those invasive species, and we give you some information about how to manage them, as well as some tools. So Indiana's got it going on. It's a wonderful program with lots of partners. There's no reason right now not to jump on board and be part of the solution.
Great. So step one, familiarize yourself with invasives and maybe the invasives that you have on your property. So ID and
Correct.
and things like that. So if you're not in Indiana, you can work with your local university extension office, probably has resources. Your local state wildlife agency, Natural Resource Conservation Service also has information.
Soil Water
as well.
Conservation District.
Yeah, so it's going on in all states, right? Indiana just is really hit that grassroots effort. So step one, learn to familiarize yourself with invasives and their ID. What's step two? Once I know what invasives are and I know I have them on my property, what's the next step?
Well, you got to get a management plan. You need to understand how to tackle it, because most of us don't just have one in a very small pocket. Many of us have lots and lots of invasives, and we become overwhelmed. So talk to a professional, whether you seek one of us, one of the regional specialists through the SICM website, or talk to your Purdue Extension or your Soil Water Conservation District, but get a plan. Have a plan of attack so that you can start being part of the solution. You can start having native habitat on your property that promotes and supports what you want it to. So develop a plan.
All right. So develop a plan. And so inside that plan, what kind of control options is it going to give me? Do I have to go out there and hand pull them all? Do I need to use herbicide? Is there other methods that we can use to control some of these invasives?
So that plan is going to tell you how to manage each one of those species. And sometimes we can lump them all together. Let's just say you've got autumn olive, burning bush, and Japanese honeysuckle on your property in your woodlands, and you want to get rid of that.
A real trifecta.
Exactly. They often come together. You want to get rid of those so that your oak seedlings and your hickories can start to grow and regenerate and have a forest for years. So we're going to give you tips in that plan if you go through us, but some of the things that you can do is you can manually control them by cutting them and repeated cutting. You can do multiple things like cutting and using chemical. That's a little more of a, I'm going to get you on the first time. I'm not going to let you resprout, so I don't have to deal with you next year. So you can do an integrated management plan and have several different techniques. And we can write all of that out for you. That information is also available on our SICM website. Tons of information on there for landowners. And a lot of it came from Purdue Extension, and Purdue University. So lots and lots of information out there. And different techniques for a different species. If you've got a lot of garlic mustard, we're going to tell you, pull it in the spring, get rid of it. If you wait too late, you could try to kill it in place. But typically it's going to be timed, and the treatment will be for that species for that time of year that's best to do it.
So, mechanical through hand pulling or cutting down. You have herbicide, right? A lot of them are going to need herbicide.
A lot of them do.
If you cut it down, it's kind of, we talked about in previous episodes about the tools of habitat management. So Aldo Leopold's 5 tools, which are the axe, plow, cow, fire, and gun. And we kind of talked about, well, what other tools do we have? And we hit on herbicide, right? Herbicide's such an important thing that we need to have for a lot of these invasive species, because a lot of them, mechanical may not be enough, right? So
oftentimes mechanical is just one tool to really effectively get at the invasive, so that you're not returning year after year after year and managing the same spot over and over again. That little dab of chemical, we're not asking you to get in a plane and, blast it in your forest or across your grassland. We're talking about spot treating, very, very targeted treating, very small amounts of chemical. And all of that is also available on the website too. We have a calendar of control that'll tell you when to do it, what product to use, how to do it, and how much.
Great. So targeted spot treatments in a lot of cases for these invasives of herbicide. So what about things like prescribed grazing with goats?
Mm-hmm.
Is that an option?
So there's a little bit of controversy. Jared, you brought that up with goats. So grazers can certainly come in, and there's probably a place for grazers. They can graze. Sheep do a little bit different. They graze actually, and goats browse. But you would have to use those with other types of techniques. So let's say that you wanted to get rid of multiflora rows, and they will eat multiflora rows, but they're only going to eat to where they can reach. So if your multiflora rose is really tall and is growing up into your trees, they're not going to reach that, and they may not have the effect you want. So you may bring them in to kind of allow you to then have access to your infestation, but they're going to be part of a treatment plan, and they're not going to get rid of it all for you.
Great. So how about another potential tool of prescribed fire? Can that be helpful in controlling some invasives?
Absolutely. We use fire on TNC property. We use fire on our forest bank property. Typically, we're going to come in, again, we're going to identify those invasive species. We're going to write a plan, because some species you must get under control before you can use fire. And then you implement fire to maintain that natural habitat. So you've got to understand what you have, because fire can promote the growth of invasive species. Some invasive species, especially grasses, love it. If you have an infestation of stilt grass and you run fire through it, you're going to have even more stilt grass. So understand what you have, and then implement an integrated treatment plan. And fire can certainly help maintain native habitat.
Awesome. So I think, it goes to show you that the same tools that we're using to create habitat for wildlife are the same tools that we can use to control some of these invasive species, right? So
absolutely,
there's a lot of overlap there.
Yes.
All right. So I know what the invasives I have on my property. I've got my plan. I've implemented my plan. I've controlled the invasives. What do I do next? Do I just let the native seed bank respond? Do I need to plant something in there? That's a common question I get, especially in forested areas, of what comes after the invasives.
That's a great question. So if you've got a good area, I would encourage you to stand back, do some monitoring for multiple years. Remember, you're going to have a seed bank that you've got to monitor. So monitor twice a year, make sure that you're staying on top of that, and let that native seed bank do its thing. On TNC property, we rarely, unless we're doing a total restoration from, say, an ag field into either a forest, or we're going to create a forest there, or we're going to do a grassland. Normally, we just come in and we get rid of the invasives, we monitor, and we let the natives come back. And when they do, it's a beautiful sight. We've got something that's native right there to that locality. And again, we're creating that diversity of habitat in these mosaics across the landscape.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because I think it's really cool to kind of watch the native seed bank respond in a lot of these places where You may control bush honeysuckle, and I've done this on several properties where you control bush honeysuckle, so Amwar honeysuckle, and then you get all kinds of native forbs and grasses, things that have been just dormant in the seed bank for years, kind of just waiting their turn. They're waiting for enough sunlight and enough resources to germinate. So, but I think the other thing too is I like that you talked about monitoring, because in some cases it can be like peeling back layers of an onion, right? So you get rid of one invasive, and then maybe you see another invasive, right? And so there may be times when you definitely need to monitor to make sure that when you control that first invasive, there wasn't another invasive that's waiting there to have its turn at capture resources.
And that happens a lot. We've brought in a lot of different things. So we shouldn't be deterred by that. And I think the picture behind you, I know your listeners cannot see it, but the picture behind you speaks volumes. Absolutely volumes.
I'll have to post this picture on social media to kind of give an example. And that site there, like I said, it was almost pure wing burning bush. We ran a fire through that site to top kill all that wing burning bush to get it till it was a smaller size, and then it also helped kill some of the seedlings. And then we went back with herbicide to control those sprouts of that wing burning bush, and then ran another fire through there, and voila, no seeds planted other than what was there and what the birds planted for us. So
and the less resources, money that we have to spend, let's not do it. Let's not bring anything that doesn't need to be there. It'll be healthy just on its own if we just give it a little chance.
All right, so we've identified our invasives. We've got a plan. We have implemented our plan. We've watched that native vegetation, native seed bank come back, and now we're gonna monitor, right? Continue to monitor to make sure that nothing new pops in, or birds don't drop seeds and create a new invasion. And
absolutely. And at that point, you're kind of ahead of the game. So you want to monitor twice a year, walk your property, have fun, enjoy, be inspired by it, but make sure that nothing new pops up. And if it does, you want to get at it right away, and you will continue to stay ahead of the game at that point. But don't give up monitoring.
Yeah. And that should be in that plan, right?
Absolutely.
To tell you what the steps are in those plans. Dawn, you provided some really good steps that landowners and others should think about as they're tackling the challenge of invasive species on their properties. You really laid it out nicely, and we appreciate that. And you really provided a lot of good organizations and resources to reach out to, especially for those Indiana landowners. But for those landowners that are outside of Indiana, we're going to put some resources in the show notes down at the bottom to provide you some more information about invasives in your state and other places. So, Dawn, as we end our conversation here about invasive species, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share with the listeners?
I think as Jared, maybe as we wrap up here, I think one of the really cool things is to understand why we need to manage invasive species, is to understand the definition of a native species. And Dr. Talamy and I think Rick Dark kind of nailed it. And, they said that a native species is one that has evolved in a given place over a period of time, long enough to develop that essential relationship for life. The common one, we mentioned the Virginia white butterfly that needs native mustards. You bring in garlic mustard, it's dead. The other one is the monarch butterfly. It's got to have milkweed. Without it, it can't complete its life cycle. But that's the way most of the species on the planet are. They have a relationship with those natives. Let's enhance it. Let's take the challenge. And that is really why we manage invasive species. They cause harm, direct harm, whereas a native species is just part of the system. It can't get any better than that.
Jared, that was a really interesting discussion with Dawn. The stuff going on over there, I'm really envious of, just like from Iowa. Like, I just wish we had that going on. If that was going on in every state, I think we'd be in a lot better shape in our conversations and addressing these challenges of invasive species that we started the episode with.
Yeah, and so we're pretty Indiana-centric in that portion of the episode, but there's lots of good resources in other states to help other landowners with invasive issues. And so Don and I talked a lot about invasive plants, Adam, right? But there's more than just invasive plants, right?
Yes, and that's where we're headed next, actually. So we're going to pick up and head to the south to talk to someone that's going to be familiar to anybody that listens to Natural Resources University, Dr. Bronson Strickland, who's a deer expert, but he's known for his expertise in deer, but he's also known and really active in the management of feral hogs in the southern United States, which is a really big and growing challenge of an invasive species. And so we thought, let's do a complete 180. We've been talking a lot about plants. That's the main way that invasive species impact wildlife habitat. But let's go learn something different from Bronson about the impacts of feral swine. And we'll cut to that interview now. All right, Bronson, thanks for joining us on Habitat University for the first time, but hopefully, certainly not the last time.
Hopefully it will not be the last. Thank you, Adam. I appreciate the invitation. Pleasure to be here. Hopefully I can add a little something, but we'll see. Maybe not.
Yeah, no, I definitely think you can. And we've been talking this episode about invasive species generally, and I don't know, is it true that the southern United States has it particularly hard when it comes to invasive species? It seems like there's a lot of challenges down there with invasives.
I can't say we have it significantly more difficult than other places or other regions, but I know it is difficult here.
Okay.
And we have a lot of, I guess, charismatic invasive species that make it difficult. And, Asian carp, for one, and that ventures up into your neck of the woods or your neck of the reservoir or river or whatever, aquatic system.
Yep.
And of course, vegetation. I think most recently Kogon grass is one that is spreading north that we're particularly having trouble with and trying to deal with.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, that's not one I'm familiar with and not one we've talked about yet. I'm interested, you say charismatic invasive species. So tell me more about what you mean when you say a charismatic invasive species.
Well, I guess garners a lot of attention, whether you're an expert in plants or animals. It's something you see and you notice. And then, of course, when they get bad, they start affecting your life. And most notably, from a terrestrial standpoint, wild pigs in the Southeast is probably our most charismatic, noticeable one that affects people's lives.
Okay. Yeah. And that's actually why we wanted to have you on, because we know you're an expert in that arena. And well, fortunately, Jared and I live in states where exotic invasive pigs are not a problem yet. And so we tend to think about invasive species challenges in terms of their plants primarily, but you've already brought up two vertebrate examples, pigs and Asian carp. And that's kind of what we want to explore a little bit more detailed with you. So what's the deal with vertebrate invasive species and their impacts on wildlife and wildlife habitat?
So yeah, vertebrate species, again, in this case, wild pigs, their numbers, it's fascinating if it wasn't so detrimental. The numbers at which they have increased in the Southeast over the last 2 to 3 decades. So big picture historically, for at least a couple hundred years, there have been very, very small populations in Texas and Florida. But what we've seen starting in the 1970s and 80s is we started to see populations expand all throughout the southeastern US. And my specific example in Mississippi, when I started looking at some of the historic data, maps that showed occupation of wild pigs, is that in the 80s, we were probably looking at less than 5% of Mississippi was occupied by wild pigs. And now we're virtually 100%. Every county at any given time is going to have a wild pig on it. And a lot of counties have a lot of wild pigs on them. If we want to look at it numerically, and Adam, you deal with these type of data, we can't sit here and tell your audience there are this many wild pigs in Mississippi. These are best estimates based on the data we have. And one that we use a lot, of course, is hunter surveys, Same way we get estimates for deer population sizes and ducks and things like that, is we survey hunters and what did they see, what did they harvest, etc. Using those same methodologies, just literally over the past 20 plus years in Mississippi, we saw that hunters were harvesting about 30,000 pigs a year, which is a very big number. So that's just what hunters are harvesting. That's not what they're seeing. That's not saying that's total population. That's just what they killed. And during the last 2 years in Mississippi, that number has grown from 30,000 to 300,000.
Wow.
We are mirroring Louisiana in that now the number of wild pigs harvested has surpassed the harvest of white-tailed deer.
Wow.
And we are, the data, again, very big scale. It's hard to make a lot of inference in terms of cause and effect, but it sure is coincidental, nonetheless, that we're seeing a slight decline in deer harvest. And there could be a lot of explanations for that. But we've seen this dramatic increase in wild pig harvest, which leads us to think maybe we have some competition issues, maybe competition for resources, et cetera. And then we look at people that manage land, whether they're leasing land or owning land. The damage that wild pigs cause is kind of off the charts compared to a lot of other invasive species. So just in Mississippi and just dealing with private lands, through surveys, we have estimated $60 to $70 million a year is damage caused by wild pigs.
Wow.
Yeah.
That all just blows my mind. I guess I knew that was ongoing, but the rate at which the harvest, which we assume is an index for population size, has changed recently is really remarkable. So I guess I have questions about, because it's a habitat podcast, I have questions in two different directions. One direction is like, okay, well, what's the impact? If we go from 30,000 pigs to 300,000 pigs, what are they doing to everything else? And then my other question is, wait, what is it about the habitat down there that's allowed this population to go from 30,000 pigs harvested annually to 300,000 pigs harvested annually so quickly? So I don't know, can we go in both directions? Are they, because we talked earlier in the show about like how invasive species can change their environment and like create like positive feedbacks. And I'm curious, like, is that going on down there? What's going on with those pigs to be exploding like that?
Yeah, well, let's cover something that's probably most likely very different from some of these other species, is that we have humans behaving badly and are facilitating the spread of wild pigs. So wild pigs are very good at surviving and colonizing on their own. They are a generalist, habitat generalist, which they can live in Mexico, they can live in Canada, and everywhere in between. They're also, there's a lot of species we say like wild turkey are omnivores and opportunistic omnivores, but I think wild pigs are the most opportunistic
Wow.
of opportunistic omnivores. So carrion, herbaceous matter, they're predators as well. And I'm not talking about running down a white-tailed deer or challenging a bear, but I'm talking about, we know they can consume small mammals. We know that herpetofauna, think about, this is kind of a playful way to think about it, but I term them a Hoover vacuum cleaner of the forest floor. It's literally anything that they're going to be able to extract protein from and other nutrients they can consume. Lots of people have found their bellies full of earthworms, massed on and on in terms of competition with our native wildlife. It really, Adam, it just goes on and on, the types of impacts they can have and the competition that they can have with our native wildlife. I'll add too with that, Adam, a study done here by my colleagues, and it was looking at, gosh, I can't remember the specifics in terms of the number of properties. It was approaching 30 or greater than 30 independent properties. and a comparison was made, properties that had wild pigs occupying the sites and properties that did not. And it was a camera trap study. And there was a 26% difference in vertebrate diversity, wildlife diversity, in the places that had pigs versus those that don't. And I mean, the direction of that is a 26% decline in vertebrate wildlife diversity. So that's an association for sure. Trying to really nail down what is the exact cause and effect of that, the mechanism, we really don't fully know yet. It may be competition for space. It may be exploitation, competition for food. We don't really know, but we know the end result. Places that have a lot of pigs, we see this cascading effect on other wildlife.
Wow. You mentioned at the start of your answer there that people were a part of the problem. And I've been pretty hard on the horticulture industry during this episode already. And we've already implicated people in creating some of
Okay.
the challenges we have with invasives. But I'd like to hear a little bit more on that. When we think about that insane population growth we see down there. Like, how is it that people are interfering with that? Are they feeding pigs or moving pigs or what?
Yeah, thank you for redirecting my attention. I went off on a tangent there. So yeah, what about the human facilitation of the problem? Well, I don't know if you've ever done this, Adam, but wild pigs can be fun to hunt. I mean, it's a prized game species in Europe to go hunt, a wild boar. The same occurs here. Well, this is another one of the marvels of science, is the science finally caught up, is that when over the past 3 decades, when you start examining the spatial distribution of wild pigs throughout the US and North America, you would notice these clusters, again, where I started a moment ago, Texas, Florida, a few spots, North Carolina, for example, in the Smoky Mountains. And we noticed that, the populations were expanding spatially. That's normal colonization that wildlife do. Well, about 20 years ago, we started seeing these independent spots popping up all over the US, including Indiana would be a good example, including Michigan, et cetera. It goes on and on, Ohio. That's impossible. The old
Yeah.
joke about when pigs fly. Well, they don't.
Yeah, right.
And they didn't arrive there through a natural process. So we concluded that this is being facilitated by humans moving them for the purpose of establishing a population for fun to hunt. Genetics has now proven that.
Wow.
And so now there's enough genetic samples collected all throughout. Experiments have been done within Florida, within California. Most recently, I saw a report, one linking a population in the Midwest, and I believe it was Indiana, to genes from Louisiana. So active translocation of pigs like that. So we collectively, human beings, are part of this problem.
That's right. Yeah. And I'm trying to think of like sort of a generalizable insight that the challenges of invasive pigs in the South offer for us. And maybe that's it. Like, is the lesson in this story like just like a cautionary tale? Are there discussions down there about like when we could have stopped this before we harvested 300,000 pigs in Mississippi? Like, what's the lesson as we think about applying the lesson from feral hogs in the South to plants and fungal pathogens and everything else that we have invasive species challenges with?
Well, I'll give you my 2 cents, Adam. And I think what I'm about to say is very accurate, but I do not have hopes that it will change. And I think the lesson is, if we, and I'll again use Mississippi as an example, if we had collectively exerted the time, money, and effort to control wild pigs when they occupied less than 5% of the state, we would have it whipped. However, it wasn't enough of a problem back then to garner the attention. And so it is difficult if you are managing a state's budget. I'm talking big money, big government. It's really difficult to allocate money to be proactive when something's coming. We don't deal with it until now it's a problem. Now we act on it. And we could sit here and come up with 100 examples of that. Pandemics can be a great example for that.
Right.
That's probably the biggest lesson is be proactive, and do something when you have the opportunity, and you'll be far more efficient and certainly more effective.
I really like that lesson. I think the interesting thing about that is that can apply whether you're managing 12 acres of ground and have a first arrival of a species that has invasive properties, or if you're managing the Department of Interior's budget and trying to allocate priorities in terms of protecting giant land areas or protecting commerce or other things. Because you mentioned the millions of dollars of negative impacts. Would you say $60 million of negative impacts of feral hogs in Mississippi? So,
Yeah.
wow.
And Adam, one more thing, just so it's not too egghead academics here talking theoretically about what should happen. I've had so many times giving workshops, seminars, et cetera, on wild pig management. Someone will come up afterwards and they'll say something to the effect of, about 5 years ago. It seems like that's always the number. It's never 10 or it's about 5 years ago. We too started seeing wild pigs on our property. And they'll say, and to be honest, we thought it was pretty cool. It was novel. We thought we were going to have something else to hunt. And just seeing another large mammal on the landscape, it was just really fun to see. And then starting about 2 or 3 years ago, there not many years in between there, the honeymoon period's over in 2 to 3 years, and they become a problem. So one more thing, Adam, to keep in mind, along with the expansion that we're talking about, is you have to keep in mind the fecundity of the species. So everybody is so familiar with white-tailed deer, of course, and we've got this burgeoning population of whitetails, et cetera. What are we going to do about it? Think about a large mammal that is physiologically capable of producing twice a year rather than once. And instead of a doe having 2 fawns, a sow that may have 6 or 8 piglets. So you can see the trajectory of population growth, how much steeper it is for wild pigs. And that's why it only takes a couple years. And you went from seeing a solitary boar and a sow, and now you've got 20, 50, whatever, 100. Adam, we deal with people all the time that they started a trapping program on a property of 1,000 or 1,500 acres, and they're trapping 200, 300, 400 pigs a year. Wow. Tell me that doesn't have an impact on habitat.
Yeah, it's really remarkable. I mean, as a cautionary tale, and the things you're talking about are the themes we've talked about on the episode already to this point, that you haven't heard, but the listeners will have heard. You're talking about, we talked about this idea of the invasion triangle, and we can like almost reinforce that because you just walked us through it. There's invader attributes like really fecund species and certain survival rates, and you said a habitat generalist, like, well, that's invader attributes that are going to create for a problem. We talked about site characteristics. There's not a lot of things in the South other than hunters that are going to kill a pig or kill piglets, and it's going to create conditions that really favor their growth. And then site environmental conditions, they're obviously finding resources down there in those ag landscapes or those forested landscapes, and it creates a perfect storm for an invasion. And yeah, the cautionary tale, I think, and the takeaway, that's just like a perfect way to wrap up this episode, I think, is we got to be proactive on this stuff. There's work to do. It may not seem like a problem right now, but in just a matter of a couple of years, you can create these giant issues, no matter how big your property is. If you're managing just a small acreage, or if you're a state government or federal agency, I think it's a little bit of a down note to end the episode on, but it's true, and it inspires us to act because it is the right thing to do, and we don't want to see those decreases in wildlife diversity. We don't want to see those negative environmental impacts, and so that's why it is really important to talk about invasive species. So
to add to that, Adam, one more thing that can be a high note is where we see success is this is yet another reason to cooperate with adjacent landowners, et cetera, is that if and it's very frustrating if you own, lease, manage, whatever, 300 or 400 acres, but the neighbor adjacent to you is not managing wild pigs, you're always going to have a problem. So not only can you work with your neighbors on managing habitat to increase the abundance of the species you're interested in, you can work together on eliminating invasive species.
Well, and that connects perfectly to the guests we had on right before you and the awesome work that they're doing with invasive species management through the Nature Conservancy in Indiana. And there's other bright spots around where people are taking very seriously this landscape level approach to addressing these challenges, protecting wildlife and wildlife habitat. So that's a perfect way to end it, Bronson. I really appreciate your time coming on the podcast for the first time, but definitely not the last. And we want to remind the listeners, if you find the survey in the show notes, give us some feedback. We're getting ready to wrap season 1. And so we really want your feedback on the direction to take this in season 2. And we appreciate you hanging on for what was a long episode, but hopefully you learned a lot about invasive species.
Habitat University is hosted by Purdue Extension and Iowa State University Extension and Outreach, and is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
The network is supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you liked Habitat University, subscribe and listen to the other podcasts in the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
Iowa State University and Purdue University are equal opportunity, equal access, and affirmative action institutions.